Taylor, defence editor of The Guardian, multiple batches of people you've written for. Don't necessarily list them. So basically, holding this event in conjunction with Strife. There's flyers here. It's King's blog. It's not sponsored by us, but it's part of King's, and it's written. Well, it's all written by students from King's. So we're they're new, and we think it's a good initiative. So if you're interested, you can take a flyer or speak to some of the members of Strife who are here. What we're going to do today is Richard's going to talk for
10 minutes or an hour, and then
some amount of time. And then we have some questions which we thought beforehand, but if any of you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. And yeah, we have wine, orange juice, and some various things to eat at the back if you want that. And then afterwards we'll have a minute where we can just talk about in particular. So nothing else to say in the introduction. I think I'll just pass it over to Richard.
Well, I can go around my career really first, and then talk about what I've learned from it, and ask me any questions you like about Afghanistan, Iraq, the state of the British military, the Ministry of Defence, anything you like. But just briefly to stay, when I left university, I was leaving university my last year, British Oxford actually, but the history teacher didn't know. Well, I didn't know what I wanted to do. The history teacher had certain contacts. That was a long time ago, in the 60s, late 60s, when they said, I know a job for you. So suddenly a telegram, they had telegrams in those days. You know what a telegram is? Written down on paper. And come to the Ministry of Defence for an interview. You may like this. Interesting job. And so I went there. Actually, it was MI6, but they called themselves something else now. Ministry of Defence research thing, because my parents were, I came from a military family, so they thought this maybe. I didn't get a really good degree actually. That's even more of a chance to get a career in some way slightly different. The Secret Intelligence Service, commonly known as MI6, and then I said thanks, but no thanks. They invited me again. I still didn't know what I wanted to do, and they started testing me. Quite good questions actually. This was a long time ago, and you may not even remember this at all. It's ancient history. But Harold Wilson was a prime minister. And one of the problems was Rhodesia and UDI and Unilateral Declaration of Independence. You may remember this, maybe you've learned about this one. And there was a whole argument about kith and kin. And could the British soldiers go and fight the colonial troops of Rhodesia who were disagreeing? They were betraying the crown by this unilateral Declaration of Independence. Anyway, they asked me this question, and it's a very good question because I said yes, they should have done. But Harold Wilson was very frightened and very worried. His advice he was given was divided. A lot of people said, I think the army said, no, we won't. We don't want to fight the kith and kin, i.e., white Rhodesian soldiers. But a lot of other people, including the spooks, the intelligence services, says the kith and kin, the white Rhodesians will not shoot at British soldiers. That was a big issue at the time. Anyway, so I said no to MI6 after all, and I went to Brussels. I went to College of Europe in Bruges, which is quite a good postgraduate institution actually. Most people who go to College of Europe in Bruges go to join international organisations, the UN and the European Commission, which is of course just down the road in Brussels. Anyway, so I studied political science in Europe. Quite interesting, very easy sort of subject, and rather waffly subject, actually, I say. But and so then I joined. I became a freelance journalist in Brussels because Britain was about to join the community, as we then called it. Now it's called the European Union, as you know, but then we called it the European Community. And there were very few British journalists there. But it was a very good listening post because NATO was there. Because de Gaulle had just kicked NATO out of France in 1966, I think it was. I was there in about 1968 and started, you may remember the kind of revolts around Europe in 1968, if you read about these things. Anyway, so some of us said, let's have a sort of revolution throughout Europe, start the boundaries kind of thing. And then people didn't, even the Trotskyists in France would say, revolution in one country first. So first attempt to have a sort of European rebellion, if you like, or revolt. didn't quite work because of the Germans and the French and so on. Let's do it in our own country. A non-Trotskyist approach really, to that European student revolts around the place, which soon, of course, finished. And so I stayed in Brussels writing for various people. NATO was there, MI6 was still on my back saying, please tell me what's going on, because there were permanent negotiations there. The British had become members of the European community at the same time as Ireland, Denmark and other countries. And a lot of these countries wanted to get their own back against Britain, because Britain only had one vote in this institution. And Britain, having sort of before bullied really Ireland was really in hock to Britain economically, and the Danes who joined the European community at the same time was in hock also economically to Britain. But they were all in this new club, and Britain had only one vote, and all the other people only had one vote. And it was great to be a journalist there, because the British wouldn't tell you anything, because they're very secretive and still are. So all the Irish would tell you stories about what the British were up to, or the French, or the Germans or something. And of course the British were very secretive and they didn't tell you. So they soon learned, though, because we were writing stories which embarrassed the British, because they were permanent negotiations about everything, about monetary policy, about diplomatic policy, about tariffs, commercial policy, and everything else. And anyway, so that was a goldmine really for journalists. I mean, documents were leaked all over the place and so on. And it was quite important, because I think it's relevant now, because a lot of, we had summit meetings like this, so of course in Brussels. People who followed the British Prime Minister were the political editors. And the political editors in Britain still think that, you know, Westminster, well, if Britain's not the centre of the universe, Westminster is, and they tend to have a very patronising approach, I think, still. Maybe disagree in the British press about Britain's allies in Europe and NATO and everywhere else for that matter. It's still there, this kind of, this sort of imperialistic colonial approach to that we are better than anyone else and look down on the Europeans and so on. But it's much better seeing, I think, Europe in Brussels, and Britain in Brussels, in its place, really. And it wasn't, it had to deal with its allies and so on. And they couldn't sort of bully, they tried to, but the English, the British Prime Minister couldn't bully the British as much as they thought they could. There were big arguments. I mean, arguments which we expect to have, before the Second World War, certainly. Arguments in 68 and 75, which you expect to have in 1945. Anyway, I came back to London, and I think probably benefited from that experience, really, and covered especially first official secrecy and so on. Someone else was doing defence then, and another interesting aspect of the further you go abroad, you meet British people, including now, you meet someone in the British Embassy in, say, Kabul, they will talk much more freely the further they are away physically from London, their base, because ministers and their bosses aren't looking over their shoulder and so on. So they're much, British diplomats and other people spoke quite freely in Brussels, and they certainly do now. When I came back to Britain, they were much more secretive, and remained so. I was working quite a lot with Peter Hennessy, who was then a Times Whitehall correspondent. I worked with The Guardian on official secrecy and so on. Peter Hennessy has a different career. He's now a Professor Lord Peter Hennessy at Queen Mary College. You may know of him. He's a very good lecturer, actually, but got the gift of the gab. He's a Professor of Contemporary History there. Anyway, and also I thought that the British sort of structure of specialist lobbies, I mean, defence correspondents got very close to the Ministry of Defence, just like political journalists got very close to the Prime Minister, and diplomatic correspondents got very close to the Foreign Office, and so on, too close, I think. And the BBC at one point too thought that, and you may remember the Andrew Gilligan affair, which led to the Hutton inquiry, which was about the BBC journalist Andrew Gilligan, who said on the Today programme one morning in I can't remember what it was, but anyway, he said just after the invasion of Iraq that the dossier, the famous weapons dossier, had been sexed up, I think was the phrase at the time. And the reason why Andrew Gilligan was chosen by the BBC or BBC editors to be defence correspondent, because traditionally the BBC had had far too close, the defence correspondent far too close to the Ministry of Defence establishment. And that went, I think, for most other specialist correspondents. But I could see that it's much better to, as a journalist, to play Whitehall departments and vested interest groups against each other. For example, there's always an argument between the Ministry of Defence and the Treasury, because the Treasury doesn't think so, MOD with some justification actually, doesn't spend money wisely. So if you want to get good stories about the Ministry of Defence wasting money or whatever, you go to the Treasury. The occasional whistleblower, maybe not many of them. And if you want to get some story relating to the Treasury, go to the Ministry of Defence. And the Foreign Office is bashing the Ministry of Defence. The Ministry of Defence is slugging off the Foreign Office and differing to the Department of International Relations. So as a journalist, that was quite, you could maybe say that's frivolous and so on, but actually it was quite useful, because you could go to play one department off against another. What I'm saying is, you could stand back from any kind of speciality, and you've got to know, what you were. I hope anyway what you were talking about. And as time went on, you get quite good think tanks now. RUSI is quite a good one. I'm an advisory council member at RUSI. Michael Clark, who is Defence Studies here, is the director of RUSI. There's the IISS, International Institute for Strategic Studies. There's one Chatham House, which is probably not so good actually. I think, yes, someone is here is probably closely linked to Chatham House. Anyway, think tanks go up and down. I think RUSI is quite good at the moment, because you get good experts, and they ask, and they know about particular subjects. Maybe people like people in the war studies department. Anyways, so covering defence and the state really, and the morale and the activities and the relationship between the military and the politicians in Britain since, we'll just talk about the last few years. Tony Blair, as we all know, was a great interventionist. He wanted to go everywhere and didn't ask too many questions. Probably know about the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And of course the military were up for it. I mean, they were concerned about the legality of it. And the then Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Michael Boyce, was concerned about that and insisted on getting that. Could you tell me unequivocally, he said to the Attorney General of the government, the Chief Law Officer, that it would be legal to invade Iraq? And so the Attorney General at the time, Lord Phil Smith, phoned up Tony Blair's people at number 10 Downing Street. Of course, it's unequivocally legal. So Boyce said, that's fine, go ahead and join the American invading Iraq. But there's a lot of discomfort amongst military commanders about that. Also, because of course then it becomes a great controversy. The invasion and occupation of Iraq became politically controversial, and now, of course, we've got Afghanistan, which is even more unpopular, at least the military presence in Afghanistan is. But there's a lot of tension between the British military and the politicians, their political masters, which is still there. And we know the British military thought, we can deal with Iraq, we know all about all this and counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland and everything else. And we can tell the Americans what to do. There are a lot of fierce arguments behind the scenes actually in Iraq when the Americans thought the British should know all, started to know about counterinsurgency. But of course the British didn't do very well for various reasons. They didn't have enough kit or enough people to cope with Basra and so on. They left Basra with their tail between their legs. The Iraqis and the Americans had to sort out in 2006. Then Britain went, thousands of soldiers went to Helmand, not a very well thought out, rather ill-prepared presence in Helmand province. Still 10,000 British troops. And they had no idea really of what they were doing. They thought at the time it was going to be very easy. Lord John Reed, who was then the Defence Secretary, said, we'll give it there, we hope we won't fire a shot in anger because it's well, they had a sort of stabilization operation where they had no clue. The intelligence was really, really bad. We can talk hours and hours about intelligence, the lack of intelligence, not only about Iraq but also about Afghanistan. They had the whole sort of, the ink spot, people know what the ink spot tactics were. The British had little patrol bases of a few soldiers here and there, demanded by the Afghans, actually. What they call patrol bases, and they couldn't defend themselves, they couldn't be supplied, and the whole thing was a complete mess, and now accepted. Some of us were writing about it at the time. And the other point is, because if British soldiers don't speak, British military commanders and generals don't speak truth to power, they don't tell their politicians, they don't tell their political masters or ministers what, no, we can't do this, or we need more kit, because the politicians will say, oh, you don't need more kit, you just... And anyway, if you don't like what you're doing, we'll cut the budget in half. If you don't want to fight, there's no point, we'll send you anyway. So of course the military react. Of course we want to fight, otherwise, there's no point in having us doing anything. And so there's quite a lot of tension there, and is still there as well. They don't know how to deal, the British chiefs of staff don't know how to deal with ministers still, particularly. They will slag off privately Cameron and politicians for not knowing anything about war and military, because they haven't been, none of these people have been, there's no national service, of course, when they were young. And there are very few people who've had any military experience in the House of Commons. One or two MPs have been Tory MPs, not any Tory MPs. A handful maybe have been soldiers, some in the reserves. And so they there's a tension, there's an underlying tension between the military and the politicians. In the SDSR, the so-called security and what we call the security, the Strategic Defence and Security Review, 2010, the British government brought in or agreed to just after the coalition government in 2010, a few months after it came into power. And that was a completely chaotic thing, and how the armed oil was suddenly stopped and no more Harriers, and suddenly decided to buy 2 aircraft carriers, and that argument you probably know about, and it can be, a lot of people say the whole defence budget is skewed. Anyway, then there were a lot of arguments behind the scenes, and Cameron, just at the beginning of the, and they're all fighting, all the heads of each service, Army, Navy and Air Force, chiefs of staff were fighting each other. I mean, they were saying, we want more ships, and the Army was saying ships are irrelevant now, and the Air Force was saying tanks are irrelevant, and you've got all these guys. It's great for journalists, actually, for all these people slagging each other off. But Cameron, who then got rather peeved with this, and he said at one point quite sharply, you do the fighting, I do the talking, he said to the chiefs of staff just before the Libyan campaign, the bombing campaign over Libya. And since then, the military has sort of kept their mouths shut. They're not in good nick, I think, but it's certainly not the army, because what are they going to do after Afghanistan? That's a big question. What is any Western army going to do after Afghanistan? The Americans said, there's no appetite, and it seems to be in the British public opinion, certainly not American public opinion. The Americans are going pivot, the great word pivot, they're going west to the Pacific and Asia, and that's all sea power and air power and not ground forces. You ask what the army, you ask any army guy what's the future of the army, and they say, God knows. Special forces will be around, but not many, there won't be many missions that people can see. And a lot of bright young officers are leaving the army, and some are coming here to do theses and graduate courses here, actually, in war studies. But anyway, so I think, you can, journalistically, it's quite frustrating because you want to provoke debates, but there's a lot of fear in the Ministry of Defence, as in there are other departments, about Britain's role in the world, and they don't like talking about it very much, and the intelligence services are quite easy to write about in one way, but they've been told to keep stum, partly because of mistakes in the past, and the whole question of rendition, which you may want to talk about, and Libya and the scandals involving Security Intelligence Service, MI6, MI5 keeps in the background. Terrorism seems to be sort of, I mean, they had problems over 7/7 and the attacks in the underground here. Cross fingers, there hasn't been a terrorist attack for quite a long time. So there we are, really, and yes, the defense of Afghanistan. You get the generals now come back and say we are doing a great job. They never knew quite what they're going to do. I mean, first it was to beat up, to stop Al Qaeda affecting or being a danger to British national security here, on British streets. So Al Qaeda is finished, as we know, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan a long time ago. So what are the British doing? Are they going to, are they defending? Are they helping to promote peace and stability and make sure that a lot more, kids go to school there? They're not doing anything on the drug front, narcotics front, and they're not doing on the corruption front either. So the guy called General Bradshaw, who's the most senior British general in Afghanistan, who said the other day he's defending the British achievements and American achievements, that matter too. And it's quite sad, really, because they say, oh, no, he says, only 15% of attacks on civilians, say in Helmand, within 10 kilometers of the main population district. Before it was 20%. I mean, they're doing a micro defense and using statistics all the time to desperately show that things are progressing, they would say. But anyway, I'm probably going to finish now, but I do think the British armed forces, not Western armed forces, are at the crossroads, and what are they going to do? Obviously UAVs, pilotless planes, more and more I think the military or special forces get in specific operations with intelligence-led operations. UAVs, but a lot of invisible things are happening. And a lot of special forces now, we don't know about it, in British special forces, for example, in Ethiopia and Somalia, and they're going to go to, helping the African Union and so on. They're going to be in Mali next. I was talking about the other big, could be the other big sort of crisis point. Could be drugs coming into these sort of ungoverned spaces of West Africa. So I think that's what the conflict in future is going to be. It's going to be the British and other Western countries helping the local indigenous forces, African Union forces, say, in Somalia, Ethiopia, Mali, and all that stuff, rather than doing it in big numbers, unless it's a big humanitarian crisis, which is something else again. Or unless, as someone said to me this morning, is Kosovo going to sort of blow up on the Baltic? Who knows? Probably not. So anyway, do please ask questions if you want.
Sure, thank you. So we have a couple of questions that we've thought beforehand, and I'll start with one. But obviously, we encourage you to question yourself. But to kick off with one, you talked, Richard, about there's sort of this like cozy relationship between journalists and those of power, or at least there was. And you obviously, I know from reading stuff that's written about you on the internet, that you received the Freedom of Information Award in the 80s, and you made a lot of your career out of uncovering secrets. But what essentially, or things that people don't want other people to know, what essentially would you say the point of journalism is? Is it telling people that stuff they don't want to know, or is it arguing a political point? Because obviously many people would argue the Guardian is a centre-left or left, depending on your rabid socialist left, depending on your viewpoint. That's what they say the Guardian is. I mean, what would you say the point of journalism?
Well, it depends. I think a different kind of journalism, actually. You can be a commentator, for example. You can be a columnist. You can be a leader writer or an analyst, more like a sort of academic, I suppose. Or you can be an investigative journalist, digging around, going for slow journalism, it's now called, or you could, like the Guardian, doing more and more, because newspapers are different animals now, and papers are doing much more. In the newspapers, editors are actually going for bigger stories, like the Guardian this week are doing something on tax, sham companies and tax avoidance and so on. And you'll do the WikiLeaks thing maybe, or you'll do big running stories, or a whole week will do concentrate on one big story, because the breaking news stories don't read on the web anyway, 24/7 and all that stuff. You can give me an ordinary reporter just talking about floods and this and the other, but I mean, I think that, you know, what do people want? The punter, kind of entertainment, wants to know what's happening in a basic, one-dimensional way. What's the weather going to be like tomorrow? They also want to know why things are happening as well. And I hope they want to know what people in power are doing. You know, people are spending taxpayers' money, or people deciding what policy, people are putting people in danger. And I think, you know, the defence obviously, or militaries, covering the military is very important, because war and peace, war, yeah. Because people's lives are at risk, you know. National security, safety of society, you know, protecting people, and I don't know if people here read newspapers or where they get the information from, and how worried people are, how they want to be journalists, and you know, I think journalism is still a great career, really, and I think. But sometimes we also rely on other people, like whistleblowers, who rely on some soldiers, for example, either who left the army or other services, or would help quietly in sort of pointing me in one direction, because they've had, you know, experience on the front line. And sometimes we get embedded. Is a Guardian journalist. Now I'm doing a master's here in war studies. Anyway, so you know, well, if you get embedded, for example, by with the British military, you're kind of hostage. You have to write about what they. You're controlled by them, actually, and you can't do anything without them physically sort of controlling you. On the other hand, you understand what they're doing. It's right over there, and the average British soldier, for example. Sorry, this is not totally off the question, but the young British soldier, or Polish or Frenchman, want to go to Afghan in their 20s and so on, and they want to, you know, get out of the system. They've been there maybe 6 months, and maybe a couple of years later, another 6 months, but then they don't do it anymore. But other people are just seeing the strategy or the tactics as well, and that's not working. So they're risking their lives and their lives of their comrades for no reason at all. So that's, but they can't say anything about it unless they leave the forces. So someone's got to, you know, write about these things and
shout about something.
Yeah, we'll give it a go.
But yeah, so open it up to yourself.
How would you characterise the coalition forces' approach to insurgency in Afghanistan? Because over the course of a sort of half-hour, you know, let's say a 10-minute presentation, I learned more about the Taliban than I think the coalition have, in that it's the Taliban is not a homogenous organisation. It's messy, it's fluid. There are internal tensions, there are external pressures, and this is something that I've always suspected when we had somebody coming to talk to us, and I just thought, why haven't the West learned this? Because it seems that with the tactics the Taliban are using now, they seem to be one step ahead simply because they have far less to lose and they have more to gain.
Well, I mean, the best, some people were saying me stuff about Lawrence of Arabia, and he had the lesson about how to deal with insurgents. You've got to get people on your side. The British and other foreign, NATO forces in Afghanistan haven't got enough people on their side for various reasons. They make mistakes. It's partly maybe the fault of Karzai. It's the fault of the influence over some of the Afghan governors over the tactics. It's mistakes made by British and American soldiers, trigger-happy people. It's we can't trust a lot of the people really, and certainly the green on blue is a kind of insurgent tactics. They can't strip these people. They've got away from the LED tactics of improvising through the devices onto this other infiltrating Afghan soldiers. So they kill British and other soldiers, but except the British will say that the British Army says that is only a small percentage. Most people who are Afghans who kill British American soldiers in their own service. Do it because of I don't know whether that's true or not. But anyway, to answer the question, they've been hiding to nothing really. They had no clear tactic, the British and NATO forces, have they really? And they've been far too ambitious. They haven't understood the tribal setup in Afghanistan. There's no sort of calm thinking about most of the Afghan officers, as well, Tajiks and Uzbeks and so on, still not Pashtuns, of course, most of the Taliban influence area of southern Afghanistan. All that, you know, and so they basically say, okay, let's give up. And half the schools, for example, the British have built, they say, well, when they leave the end of 2014, they'll have to come, and they'll close. I mean, I mean, you could write I mean, it's been a sort of mistake after mistake after mistake. I mean, go there to get rid of Al-Qaeda, fine, but then, you know, get other people to do. And you know, local forces and tribal chiefs and that matter bang their heads together. They're going to look after themselves, aren't they? They're going to, after 2014, but what's going to happen in Afghanistan. They're lucky maybe the Afghan National Army will actually keep peace for a bit, and with a lot of mineral resources in Afghanistan, maybe they'll start. The Chinese, and it's in the interest of Pakistan, China, and other countries, Russia too, and Iran, to have some kind of stability, I think, in Afghanistan. So for those reasons, we're talking very recently, they thought, oh my God, Pakistan is quite important in Afghanistan. Of course it is. The Pakistanis need some support. They need to say, we will, NATO and Americans who need to say to Pakistan, we need, you'll come in as a major player in any kind of settlement. They're really
Sean?
Sorry. How much of from Ansgar in the wars in Afghanistan, and how much do you think of the role was the weakness of the coalition in Afghanistan and a lesser extent in Iraq, in the fact that there was, I guess, bickering within the members of the coalition in coordinating their strategy? Was that a real weakness compared to, for example, the operation in Sierra Leone in Operation Alistair? You see, like, future interventions moving towards a more unilateralist framework rather than multilateral? And what do you think the strengths and weaknesses are in terms of that kind of multilateral versus unilateral?
Well, you can't compare. You can't compare Sierra Leone really with Iraq and Afghanistan. And actually, the current Chief of Defence Staff, David Richard, his initial mission, orders, like in Sierra Leone, was to get all the British and but he decided, I mean, it was quite risky actually, because it could have gone bad, but he decided to go in there and make sure that the government, I can't remember the name of the president, to protect him against the rebels. So he expanded the mission without the say-so of London, which London, when he was succeeding, the government, the British government, that's fine. But there wasn't, Iraq divided the West, but it didn't divide the people who were fighting there. The people who went in there, the Americans, the British, the Poles, and so on, Australians, New Zealanders, that they were not disunited. I think afterwards there were arguments between the British and Americans in particular. Afghanistan, there were no real arguments at the beginning. They only started to unravel much later on. And I think, the implication for NATO, I don't know what you're talking about. Do you study NATO here or whatever? Because NATO is in a serious crisis too, because it's going to be coalition of the willing. Now people are saying, oh, who joined the campaign against in Libya, the air strike campaign in Libya? Germany didn't, Poland didn't. Norway, curious enough, Norway and Denmark were dropping more bombs proportionately than the British and the French were. All the big kind of bunker bombs that went into Tripoli were old Cold War stock that the Norwegians and Danes did. Anyway, maybe that's a little known fact, I don't know. Maybe it's not a little known fact, but the point is that anyone in NATO now says coalition of the willing, and that means people who are not NATO countries, not European countries. So they say it's wonderful. In Libya we have the Qataris and UAE, few jets, one big thing, special forces of Jordan and so on, and Arab countries were involved. They got a lot of Howard, New Zealand and Australian special forces are in Afghanistan. And the Americans saying, Peter's going to say goodbye to Europe anyway, so NATO's going to get or decide what he wants to do. And it hasn't even got, actually, the Western Europeans haven't got as much kit as they need there. But the Americans have given a back seat on Libya, as we know, but they still rely, the French and the British and others still rely completely on the Americans for intelligence, coordination, radar, surveillance, all that stuff. So NATO is going to be a different animal, and I think it's sort of, people are not going to admit it. NATO will stay there as an institution, I suppose, but it will be a coalition of the willing here and there and everywhere else. The 27 countries of NATO wouldn't. 28. Anyway, 27 is the EU. They just won't do things together. They won't be united as that. Ever again, I don't think.
Is there a good excuse as to why we shouldn't reform the MOD and the army in style that the Israelis have in terms of one unified force rather than having separate army, navy, air force?
British Defence Force.
Yeah, and if that excuse exists, what other than tradition?
Well, it's just tradition actually, because I mean things that there's one or two steps have been taken on the joint helicopter force, for example, and the JS, the planes that go on the aircraft carriers, which some people may think of waste of money, well, they will defend them, but the only, British two new aircraft carriers will have American joint cyclones F-35s on them, which will be shared between the Navy and the RAF. There's a big round recently between the Navy and RAF about who's going to do them first, whose pilots are going to train on them first, and so on. People bang their heads together, so that the rivalry is difficult. Traditionally, though, too, if you said, and there's some discussions, the SDSR wasn't a couple of years ago about should the Marines emerge into the paras, say. Of course, people have cap badges. I mean, it's bad enough emerging to ordinary infantry regiments, let alone, people jumping up and down. Must have cap badges. So you get some regiments with two cap badges as a compromise, one on the back, one on the front. So anyway, I can't see it for a long time. It doesn't make rationalise saving money and so on. Of course, it makes sense, but it won't happen. I don't think ever, well, not for a very long time. And then the Royal Navy, the Royal Navy, the senior service, the 16th century, all that stuff. And they're not going to merge with the army or the air force or the army anyway. But and it wasn't that long ago we had three separate ministries. The 60s, 60s, I think, were merged into the Ministry of Defence before we had a Ministry of War, and then of Air and Admiralty, which was separate about 30 years ago. But I suppose Israel is unique, isn't it? It could make a lot of sense. You suggested, and everyone laughed, especially the Sun newspaper, and Telegraph.
Maren?
You perhaps already answered this what you said earlier, but I was wondering how you would describe the nature, the sort of essence of current British defence strategy, and perhaps, if possible, contextualize it with possible escalation of the West's relation with Iran.
So what the question is?
Oh, sorry.
Basically, what's British defence strategy?
It's going to be Iran.
Contextualise it with what is going on.
Yeah. Well, no British military commander wants any attack on Iran. They're very quite clear, and the Americans too. The Pentagon has said that. And indeed, the Israeli defense military chiefs have too. Israeli intelligence chiefs have. So it's the politicians that rhetoric and all that stuff. For various reasons. I mean, is there going to be an end of that? Is it going to be? What's the end game of a military strike on Iran? The answer is, I think, General Dempsey, the head of the General Joint Chiefs of Staff from the US, said at a briefing I was there not so long ago, it may delay, but it won't destroy Iranian nuclear facilities and the nuclear weapons program. Military strikes, as all military people tell you, military action is not doesn't solve anything. Might help the politicians. But the British have also made it quite clear to the Americans, which is actually unusual. Because, like, you know, to say no very much to the Americans, but they have made it quite clear that they would not go along with any American request to use British bases here or Diego Garcia, which they call Cyprus. So I think that's on hold in a minute. I mean, you know, Obama, the elected president, made a difference to it. I can't see, I can't see Iran being attacked. Maybe that's too rational a sort of approach, but certainly no military command in any country, Israel, Britain, America wants that to happen. Could he won't succeed? I mean, on that general point, actually, you spent all the time people were saying, General Richards, there's no military solution to Afghanistan. I'm patient with their political masters. They keep on saying, why the hell can't politicians bang their heads together and negotiate with the Taliban and this and the other and you know, Karzai and that lot talk to Pakistan, Taliban. There's no military solution to anything, which makes you think something like, what is the what's the point of being a military guy? But of course, the military, they would say, help the military solution on military action. And initially helps to prod or lead to some kind of political solution. Or the threat, I suppose, of military action in some cases. But only when it's credible. I think in Iran it isn't really credible. And there's an argument about what kind of weapons people need. I mean, some people say that actually Hope was having aircraft carriers. Why you're screwing the whole British defence budget by having aircraft carriers when they're going to be extremely vulnerable to missiles from China or Russia or anyone else. And you have the surface ships and submarines to protect the aircraft carrier, which is sitting duck and this and the other. I mean, you know, you're fighting yesterday's war and all that, invested interests, defence interests. It's not really answering, but I mean, that's going on from what we're saying about military thought, really, and the military people are military commanders are very, very conservative with a small c. They want to protect their vested interests, don't they, and their own existing force structures, really.
I'm reminded of Rupert Smith, who a lot of people would like this because we can't read him.
Utility and force.
Contain, immediate, threaten, and destroy these military forces. Seems applicable there. Do you have any questions there?
I've got a question in reference to the Justice and Security Bill. The Justice and Security Bill that recently got defeated. But in particular, my question was in reference to the secret courts. Let's say hypothetically it had gone through. What impact, if any, do you think it would have had on kind of British conduct and their military operations abroad?
Well,
if any.
The bill, which is proposes secret courts when any intelligence information is being questioned or in dispute, or people are making allegations against security intelligence services. This bill was sparked off because of one particular case was the Bin Mohammed case, where the British judges actually said that some CIA information, not very sensitive information, which was given to the MI6 and MI5, should be disclosed, because it showed that the British knew that Bin Mohammed was being abused, tortured, etc. And the judge said that, and the Americans were, oh my God, that's awful, that's awful. Now, the Americans were surprised that, not only because that information came out, which is not very sensitive information, but also because the courts, judges said, did not believe in what the Foreign Secretary at the time, David Miliband, the Labour Foreign Secretary, said. And Americans can now, in America, you have a lot of secrecy in America, executive privilege and so on. So courts in America, it's misleading to think they're all sort of open and openness and freedom of speech and stuff. I mean, up to a point, but not in certain categories. So the Americans were generally frightened, or not frightened, but they were annoyed and angry that the British judges have said no to claims made by the British Foreign Secretary. But the damage would be done to British-American relations, intelligence sharing and all that stuff. Anyway, that sparked, that persuaded the British government to introduce this bill, which is still being going through Parliament, which allowed the Secretary of State actually to say this is national security and therefore secrecy. The other thing that, as a journalist, I would say that you would not hear the evidence in future. If, for example, it wasn't just a NATO bomb, ironically, which blew up the Gaddafi's secret intelligence headquarters in Musa Kusa's office, and all the filing cabinet came up with all these wonderful papers, MI6 stamped on it, MI5 and everything else, and CIA showing that the British were involved in abducting or rendering these two leading Libyan dissidents and their families to Gaddafi's secret police, I say, the objective was possible, and where they were abused and tortured and so on. That information would not come out if this bill comes law. Anything to do with what the minister says is, quote, national security, which is actually covers a whole multitude of sins, as far as I can say. It's a very elastic concept. What does national security mean? And I think basically the minister says, you've got to have some credibility, I suppose, but it's cover a hell of a wide area and amount of information. Anyway, so, and the government defends it by saying that currently the Security Intelligence Service cannot defend themselves, because to do so in public, to do so against all these allegations from people who are incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay or anywhere else, they can't do that because it will show all our sources, informants and so on, which is actually not, maybe up to a point, but you could just redact or not use that identity of some particular informant. You don't have to use all that information to have an open court case, I think, where Security Intelligence Services should defend themselves in the open, in my view. Not, don't reveal their sources or their contacts and so on, but they've got to argue in public. Partly otherwise, anyway, the public won't believe them. These guys, any organisation which is not really accountable can't abuse their power by definition in any country in the world, and therefore, and you can't trust them. That's my personal view. Not the Guardian view, I used to have the personal capacity. Anyway, that can answer your question. That's that bill could stop a lot of information which has, for various reasons, come out in the past. Won't be able, that kind of information won't come out in future if that bill becomes law.
Magnus, we've got about 10 to 15 minutes of formal questions. If anyone wants to.
Hello, my name is Magnus. My question is, you seem to be very critical against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as is basically everyone who didn't have anything to do with and has studied it. But then my question is, now the way they're defending it, usually the ones who had some kind of something to do with, they will say, well, but it's bad. They will admit that now, but it would have been a lot worse if we hadn't done it, right?
I don't know if they say that.
But sorry, to make the question. So at least that's an argument that I was interviewing from. It makes no difference that can be the way they use that as an argument, saying it would have been worse if you hadn't done it. And so I would like you to comment on in what ways might that be right and in what ways might it be wrong. How would you have seen the world if you hadn't gone into Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think something should be done to get rid of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or to do what, if they were a genuine threat to, as they say here, the national security of Britain and France and everywhere else, and America. But there are different ways of getting rid of Al-Qaeda and the threat posed by Al-Qaeda. How many people in Al-Qaeda anyway? operating this network. You know, after a very short time, I would suggest that Al-Qaeda would no longer active physically because they couldn't move around and communicate, and also because then the Afghans themselves didn't want Al-Qaeda around anymore. I mean, actually, originally they didn't. Well before 2011, the Taliban, Taliban, the Afghans went to America to try and do deals and stuff like that, but they were ignored. There were missed opportunities even then. So you need to have had an occupation, you need to have had a sort of misjudged counterinsurgency. You know. Well, a lot of people are saying we shouldn't have counterinsurgency anyway, because it's not working, and they're looking back and saying, you know, we went in there certainly in numbers in 2006, partly I think because of the quote perceived failure in leaving Basra to tell the British, and they wanted to. The British then wanted to sort of make it up with the Americans rather than anything else, and their own pride really. We can work it in Afghanistan. Afghanistan will be quite easy, they said, but they had no idea. But also because between 2001 and 2006, they were forgetting about Afghanistan because the Americans were obsessed with Saddam Hussein. And so Taliban came in and all that. So, I mean, this is hindsight, I know, but somebody was saying at the time, actually. Not many military people, not many military minds, but they didn't dare to, didn't have the confidence to argue with Blair and so on, I would say. And it was a long, and you know, Afghanistan is a bit like sort of, you squish a balloon there, and the threat, the big bubble comes there, that part of the balloon, you squish it down. So Al-Qaeda moves, not surprisingly, from Pakistan, then Pakistan to Yemen, and Somalia, you know, all that stuff, and Maghreb, and it's very, very weak in terms of the, you know, the kind of structure, franchises, kind of franchise or whatever it is, and people, you know, inspired maybe by the by the rhetoric and the kind of ideology, but they're not instructed by anyone, like Zawahiri in some Pakistan mountain. You know, they're not don't work like that anymore. And there are other ways of dealing with this. I think, you know, famous last words, but I think the Al-Qaeda threat is exaggerated, actually, and there are other ways of dealing with genocide. And these ungoverned spaces, which are, you know, now an open sort of feeding ground really for Al-Qaeda types, whether it's Mali or Northern Nigeria or whatever. I mean, you don't have to be a genius. I'm just trying to solve these problems in another kind of comprehensive, lateral thinking type ways, I think, including economics, you know, development and all that.
We'll do this like last round, so we'll just pick the people who have their hands up now and then we'll conclude. So you at the back and then Hal, and then I conclude.
Richard, you spoke about the relationship between ministers and military officers. I was wondering what you thought the role of the media was in changing that relationship, and the position I'm coming from is last SDSR we saw the Chief of the General Staff's office grow by 10 people to do PR for the Army ahead of the SDSR. On the flip side, the first person into Benghazi after its liberation was meant to be Liam Fox, and then when Sarkozy decided he was going to go in from the French side, David Cameron suddenly tugged Fox back and said, actually I'm going, this is the leader I want. What role has the media played in changing military officers into media commentators and politicians into military officers?
I don't think it does really. I mean, we're just reporting that was a kind of dynamic which was separate from what anything the media was. The media didn't initiate it, I think. Did it?
No, but you were the ones reporting it. So the politicians were thinking this is how it will play in the media.
Yeah, but the politicians know that exactly. They're going to, and then Cameron once says and Sarkozy, well, they want their sort of broadies and so on. And that'll get built up by the media, by the French media, by Sarkozy and the British media, Cameron and so on, yeah. And they know what, the politicians know what they're doing. But, I mean, it happened almost when it comes to the military front. We reported a lot how the military had a lot of misgivings, actually not understandable, about the whole Libyan operation, the airstrikes. And by the way, Libya is not sorted out, far from it now. Anyway, they are cautious, because they are cautious, I think. And there's a legal thing, and especially after Iraq and so on, and how are we going to sort this out? America didn't want to sort of frontline role, and so on. So it was difficult. But we were reporting. I mean, if anything, the media is not reporting very much at all the tensions between the military and the British. It only comes out when the Daily Telegraph, the favourite, paper of the military, of the officer class, except when you become a sort of brigadier in the New York Times, or whatever. But not many really go there. And you get leaks, so they'll leak a thing saying, some general things, the budget cuts are ruining the army or something. But that doesn't actually help the relations between the military and the politicians either. Because they suspect all the military guys are leaking against us, embarrassing us. So it's very difficult to, I don't think the media follows this, on the example of Libya, because I'm from Benghazi and stuff, rather than actually sort of thinks about or writes about the conflict between military and political leaders, I think. Isn't it? I mean, there was I think I remember, one or two of us were writing things about how Richards, who was already Chief of Defence Staff in 2010, or 11, when the Libyan campaign started early in 2011, saying the military didn't want it. And there was a furious row when Richards had it not really fully reported, actually, between Cameron and Richard, because Cameron says Gaddafi is a target. Gaddafi personally is a target. Of course, that the military is with other kind of concerns about legal problems and international law and UN stuff. So we're furious at Cameron saying that, and you had to make sure that he said publicly, Richards did, that he's not a target. That's Israelis can go in for a target assassination. We don't do that kind of stuff. The Americans can too, that matter. Actually, that's another issue which, if you bump into any general or senior military commander, will mention to you about the increasing concern about how the law is creeping in and they're controlling their operations. For example, your human rights law, or all these cases going through courts here about, for example, negligence. There's one the other day where the army was found guilty, or at least covered by negligence, because they didn't train the people in tank crews properly, and there was a friendly fire incident. Also, the whole Land Rover question, the thin-skinned Land Rovers, natural Land Rovers were used for many, many years in Iraq and Afghanistan, built for Northern Ireland. We were complaining for a very long time about all these guys being killed there, and their hopeless against IUDs and so on. And the court said, yes, that was negligence on part of the military commanders now say the law is encroaching more and more, and we don't be able to do our job. And the whole kind of aversion to a risk, stuff. There are lawyers now in every military headquarters in the field, targeting policy and all that stuff. Which then brings the whole UAV question, and the ethics of that too, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask actually something quite similar. I suppose to put a different spin on it, do you think that the media could play any kind of positive role in turning around what I think is fair to say is like a decade of decay in the armed forces around, and maybe rebalancing this fight between politicians and practitioners in favour of the practitioners?
Well, I think it's very difficult for the media to do. I think it really needs write students to write essays or whatever. Anyway, but also and people like MPs or people getting hold of them, one or two MPs have thoughtful, considered kind of, with the help of the media too, but it's very difficult for the media to initiate all this kind of stuff, I think, individually. I mean, you can have a campaign going, and I mean, in The Guardian too, you've got to rather kind of stuff that got to think more about where this, Britain's role in the world. I mean, Richard himself says that. Now Britain has a National Security Council, which meets most Tuesdays. It's not the same as the American one, but or other countries have in South America and so on. But it's quite it's beginning to develop. And so, Britain's role in the world, its capabilities, what it wants to do. Politicians say we want to do X, Y, and Z still, but with a smaller defence force, with a smaller Armenian Air Force, or maybe I say a skewed one. People aren't actually sort of sitting there and telling ministers, look, we've got this money, we can only do that, we can't do something else. Or we can't do what you may want to do. We can't do it. It's not that debate is not about Britain's role in the world, hasn't been, and I take your point actually, it hasn't been sort of articulated properly, partly I think because the generational thing, with Britain's history, colonial history, imperial history and all that stuff, other countries can think about their role more, I think, cleanly, probably, and their alliances, whereas Britain is not outgrown things, or not grown up into a new kind of thing, I would say. Still got too many hang-ups about the past. Really. But, I mean, it's difficult, but I think journalists could help, but I think you need other people and other politicians too to. And the Defence Committee in the Commons is absolutely absurd. I mean, it's pathetic if you listen to any of their hearings. They're meant to, call ministers and officials to account and military commanders and stuff, and they're some awful sessions with an individual MP just want to sound of their own voice. They're rather, rather incoherent kind of line of questioning. So.
Okay. If you have any more questions, Richard, we'll be sticking around. Not too long, but long enough. So yeah, just obviously a few announcements, as always happens now. We've got another event tomorrow. It's a twinned event, so obviously we're publicising it. It's with the Israel-Palestine Forum. It's Dr. Avi Raz from the Oriental Faculty at Oxford, talking about his book, which is on the aftermath of the 1967 war. We're keen to you to come. It's in S-106, and you can see the 6:30 or 7:30. Someone can check that. I will check that on Facebook after this. We have a film event on Friday, which is here. It's often turns into a social after that. It's Tropa de Elite, Portuguese film about basically drug warfare in Rio slums. It's good. It's in Portuguese, subtitles. But obviously you're welcome to that. And the next Thursday we have our last academic event of the year. Dr. Eric Kaufman from Birkbeck, which is Political Sociology of American Neoconservatism, which is, that might not be the one, but the demographics and politics. I was thinking of another event after Christmas. Demographics and politics, so the effect of population change and ethnicity on politics, shown especially in the recent election, which was the power of the Hispanic and non-white vote, which essentially won Obama. Other than that, we will have some sort of Christmas social. We're still working on that, but then we finish for the year and we'll start anew whenever we all come back, sometime in mid-January. Other than that, I say there's wine, something to eat at the back, and there's these blogs from Strive, which I've already mentioned. We have some people there who will answer questions, but I'd encourage you to take one just to see if you feel like writing something and getting your name within King's, but hopefully we're going to build it up. Past this year, which is my final year, but in general, hopefully it'll be a good thing. So I encourage you to take that. The wine will get drunk, so don't put me in a bad shape if you don't have any. Other than that, I'd just like to thank Richard for coming, and thank